started. Welcome to today's discussion, the fifth session of the breakdown, where Steve Levitsky and I talk about the struggle for democracy in the United States, reflect on historical precedents in the US and abroad, and offer evidence-based reflections on the path forward. My name is Erica Chenoweth. I'm the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm speaking in my individual capacity as a scholar. Before we begin, I have a few announcements to share. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. A couple of logistics. Today's discussion is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording afterward. The video will also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel, and we encourage your participation. Please submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll make sure there's ample time for audience questions. And before we go any further, let me introduce Steve Levitsky, who is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies, Professor of Government, and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a Senior Democracy Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weakened informal institutions, particularly in Latin America. He's co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and was published in 30 languages, and Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. So Steve, we have some good timing on today's discussion because last week VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Project out of the University of Gothenburg, released its annual update on trends in global democracy in 2025, edited by Stefan Lindborg and co-authored with a lot of folks on his team. And so that means they updated tons of indicators in every country in the world to give an updated look at the state of global democracy and the state of democracy in every country in the world. So let me point out a couple of key highlights from their report, and then we'll dive in a bit more. So according to VDEM, the largest democratic declines between the years 2024 and 2025 came in the United States. In fact, the Liberal Democracy Index that VDEM measures saw the biggest annual drop in US history from 2024 to 2025 in the country's history back to 1789. So they're arguing that the backsliding episode that the US has experienced in the Liberal Democracy Index supersedes anything the US has experienced in the lifetime of their data. They argue that, and I'm going to quote now from their summary of the key takeaways on the US case. Under Trump's presidency, the level of democracy in the USA has fallen back to the same level as in 1965. Yet the situation is fundamentally different than during the civil rights era. In 2025, the derailment of democracy is marked by executive overreach undermining the rule of law, along with far-reaching suppression and intimidation of media and dissenting voices. The speed with which American democracy is currently dismantled is unprecedented in modern history. Legislative constraints, the worst affected aspect of democracy, is losing 1/3 of its value in 2025 and reaching its lowest point in over 100 years. Civil rights and equality before the law are also rapidly declining, falling to late 1960s levels. Freedom of expression is now at its lowest level since the end of World War II. Electoral components of democracy remain stable. Election-specific indicators are reassessed only in electoral years, and the 2025 scores are based on the quality of the 2024 elections, end quote. So taking a global outlook, they argued that most countries remain stable from 2024, but there are three clear democratizers. Those are South Korea, Sri Lanka, and Mauritius. All three of those are so-called U-turn cases, which means that they reversed course during a backsliding episode. That said, overall, the global outlook is that, quote, democracy is back to 1978 levels for the average global citizen. The gains of the third wave of democratization starting in 1974 in Portugal are almost eradicated, end quote. So those are some pretty jarring findings from the VDEM report, in my opinion. And I was wondering, Steve, if you wanted to start us off by just contextualizing that report a bit for listeners and sharing your thoughts about what the key takeaways are from their updated report this year.
Okay. First of all, VDEM is a very good organization. Measuring democracy is always somewhat contentious, and there's always some subjective element to it, and different organizations have slightly different measures, slightly different scores. But VDEM is a pretty reputable organization whose scores I generally trust quite a bit. I should say that VDEM's annual reports, which are what go to media and to donors, and on social media, tend to be really alarmist. And I think they sometimes make statements that are frankly off the wall, and they did that this year. To say that the world is at 1978 levels of democracy is bizarre. Let's be clear, it's wrong. In 1978, all of Latin America, except for two countries, was under full-scale dictatorship, usually military rule. All of Eastern Europe was under, and the Soviet Union were under communist rule. Every single country in Africa was under authoritarian rule, in most cases, single-party rule. The idea that the world, and that's obviously not the case today. Latin America is overwhelmingly democratic. East Central Europe is overwhelmingly democratic. Africa is more mixed, but there are a number of democracies in Africa. The world is much, much more democratic than it was in 1978. And the gains of the third wave have not been wiped out. That said, the individual measures are very careful, and I think they did a pretty good job with the United States. And what the takeaway, and this conclusion is reinforced by a report that came out from an annual report by another organization that measures democracies, Freedom House, also came out with a report last week, excuse me, with a pretty similar analysis, which ranks now the United States still as a democracy, but as considerably less democratic than all other uh, uh, European and North American democracies. And in fact, just to give a short list, the countries that VDEM now considers more democratic than the United States include Sri Lanka, Ghana, Panama, Mauritius, Suriname, Croatia. Those are all pretty unstable democracies over the last generation or two. And it puts the United States in a very, very different camp, whereas we're, at least since 1965, have been roughly in the same league as Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Canada. We're now in the same league as Sri Lanka, Panama, Mauritius, Suriname, and Croatia. This is a serious organization, and I think that their measurements are pretty good. And as you mentioned, they did not take elections into account. So if the 2026 election is crisis-ridden, that will lead to a further downgrading of the United States.
I think it's interesting that both Freedom House and VDEM came out with their reports in the same week. And I think it highlights how important these reports have become in the sort of public discourse about global democracy and democracy in specific cases. Um, what do you think is the value of people having these types of benchmarking reports as they are trying to think about strategy and how to approach a democracy movement in their own country?
Well, I think I mean, it's very useful for students and scholars who are studying political regimes across the world. I think it's been extraordinarily beneficial in the 21st century for students of democracy. I think for practitioners, it's very useful to know, again, sort of global patterns and where maybe the cases that they study stand up relative to other countries in the region and across the world. And I think for citizens who generally, may have a sense of what's going on in their country, don't often have any kind of a systematic understanding of where things are in the world or how the United States actually stacks up next to Canada or the UK. It can be really, really informative. So I think we are much better off in a world in which we've got organizations making again. There's no perfect measure, and we can contest measurements and scorings of particular cases, but both Freedom House and VDEM do a pretty credible job, and I think we're all better off with that data than without it.
Yeah. I mean, in my mind, there are also some really important opportunities to learn practical lessons from some of the cases that have had turnarounds or U-turns, and those that have what they call bell turns, which is cases that were democratizing then begin to autocratize again. The U-turn cases that I mentioned earlier follow on a paper that was released by some of the same co-authors last year about what motivates democratic U-turns during a period or a phase of backsliding. And one of the things they emphasize in that paper is the importance of kind of a mobilized civil society. Certainly, as you've talked about, institutions that are willing to sort of stand up to the backsliding episode. And I think some of the findings from that U-turn paper are also important when it comes to the timing of these things, because they're able to find patterns about how quickly a backsliding episode can consolidate into authoritarianism, and then how hard it is once it's consolidated to try to return to levels prior to that episode. So for strategic thinking, it helps, I think, to understand that there are windows of opportunity sort of not to miss in a backsliding episode, because missed opportunities can't really come back around. And I think elections are one of those important opportunities for civil society trying to mobilize against the backsliding.
Yeah, you mentioned the case of South Korea. That wasn't an election. I'm not sure I would call that a case of a U-turn, but rather a failed authoritarian power grab. But
Yeah.
it's an excellent example of a rapid and effective mobilization, both by civil society, by everyday citizens, and by legislators to push back against the declaration of martial law. I think it is an
Mhm.
exemplary case of how to defend democracy.
Yeah, that's right. And I think Brazil maybe is the example of the sort of electoral path to a U-turn.
And judicial path, because the
Yeah, that's
guy
right.
who tried to overturn the election in Brazil is sitting in prison today rather than sitting in the presidential palace like in the United States.
Yeah, good point. So I want to shift gears a little bit. One of the topics that you and I haven't really covered in our prior conversations is the relationship between democratic backsliding and international politics. But it's certainly hard to avoid that topic today. And I'm hoping we can focus a little bit on the global implications and impacts of backsliding in the US for what's happening around the world. So earlier this year, we saw the US engage in a unilateral militarized action in Venezuela, which resulted in Nicolas Maduro's abduction from Caracas and imprisonment in New York. And more recently, we've seen the US impose an oil blockade on Cuba. An oil blockade is an act of war that is causing major suffering among civilians in Cuba, with Trump recently saying that he would soon take the country. And the US and Israel are at war with Iran, having decapitated Iran's senior leadership, and in Israel's case, restarting hostilities with Lebanon. And so, I think you're a great person to talk to about this because you wrote a book with Luke and Wei a couple of years ago called Revolution and Dictatorship on the violent origins of durable authoritarianism. And in it, you observe that dictatorships that come to power through revolutionary movements, like in Iran, in Cuba, in China, are often the more durable than those that come to power in other ways. And this year alone, we've seen some of these most durable dictatorships in the world threatened or decapitated by the US under Trump. So I'm just really curious what you make of that pattern, given the fact that in some of these cases, there were many failed movements in those countries trying to have a democratic breakthrough that were not successful or were defeated, really. And what we should make of the sort of patterns of durable authoritarianism in a world in which the US is engaged in the world in the manner in which it is right now.
Wow, a lot there. I want to get back to the kind of consequences of having an unaccountable president in the United States and autocratic presidency in the United States, which I think is doing a tremendous amount of damage both to the country and the global order. But on the question of revolutionary regimes, and one thing about revolutionary regimes is they often get into fights, into wars. They often get into conflict either with neighbors or in particular with regional or international superpowers. And Iran and Cuba have both been in conflict with the United States and under threat by the United States for most of the history of these long-lived regimes. That's one of the reasons why revolutionary regimes end up being pretty durable. They tend to be very ideological. They try to sort of transform the world initially in the first years of the revolution, and that very frequently gets them into conflict with superpowers. When you're trying to change the world, the global order, the superpowers in charge of that order are going to fight you, and that happened to Iran, happened to Cuba, and sometimes revolutionary regimes fail and they lose their wars. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia was overthrown by Vietnam. But when revolutionary regimes survive these early military conflicts, they tend to emerge much stronger. They tend to emerge with a very cohesive elite. They tend to emerge with a big and battle-tested security force that can be turned effectively against its own population. We've seen that in both Cuba and Iran. And so in many, many cases, whether it's the Mexican Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, Vietnam, China, Cuba, Iran, revolutionary regimes very often endure 50, 60, 70, 80 years, which is much longer than your average dictatorship. I think we're seeing in Iran the robustness of the regime. The United States underestimated the robustness of that regime. Obviously, the U.S. and Israel can militarily wipe out Iran, but the expectation was, I think, in many quarters, if we just decapitate the leadership, the regime will fall apart. And it is an unpopular regime, and there have been massive, massive protests on and off in Iran since 2009, trying to change the regime to pretend to democratize Iran. There's a real powerful democracy movement in Iran, but it is a brutal and very effective regime, and neither mass protest nor decapitation has toppled it. I think it's very difficult to predict, but may well survive this war. Cuba, we have to see what the U.S. does. Cuba is obviously a very small, very impoverished country that if the United States, were to militarily occupy Cuba, it could change the regime. But Trump has become really enamored with this sort of decapitation strategy that worked, I think, somewhat accidentally, but seems in the short term to have worked, at least from Trump's perspective, in Venezuela. And so I think they're trying to do something similar. They don't want boots on the ground. They don't want to do the work that for better or worse that's required for regime change in Cuba. So they're going to try to change the leadership and negotiate via gunboat diplomacy this sort of compliance of the new regime. This is in some ways goes back to very early 20th century U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean, like old style gunboat diplomacy. And if Trump wants to, the U.S. is a very powerful military force. We can take the Panama Canal if we want to. We can take Cuba if Trump wants to. We can take Greenland if Trump wants to. The costs of that on so many dimensions, the medium and long-term costs are enormous. But militarily, this is the problem with having a rogue presidency, right? If a mad king decides to take Cuba, he can do it.
I'm going to focus specifically on Iran for just a minute, and then maybe we can return to your region of expertise a bit. So you just mentioned the concept of a rogue presidency and a mad king, and I'm curious on your initial read how you're interpreting the onset of the war in Iran. Is it a change in policy positions, which is to say, it's long been the position of both Democratic and Republican administrations in the United States that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon, that it needs to be contained. There are certainly different strategies to pursue that outcome. But is this just a sort of aggressive change in policy positions, Or is this something we need to interpret through a lens of democratic backsliding in the United States that has made the country more prone to war?
Good question. It's hard to answer because it's very, very difficult to understand what the Trump administration is doing. In all, you and I have been around for a number of U.S. interventions abroad. We may have agreed with them, we may have disagreed with them. Some of them may have worked okay, some of them didn't work so well. But in all those cases, whether or not we agreed with them, the interventions, almost all the cases, the interventions were publicly debated. And the administration made its goals and its strategy pretty clear. In this case, there's been none of that. There's been no public debate. There was not even a whiff of consultation with Congress, and there was no explanation for what the administration is doing. So we really, honestly, do not know what the U.S. is trying to do. I think that the evidence is pretty good, and this is evidence from U.S. intelligence, that there was no imminent threat to the United States, and probably not even an imminent threat to Israel. I'm less familiar on that. But at minimum, we had disabled their nuclear program 8 months ago, and Iran was in no position to threaten us militarily. So this was absolutely a war of choice. Previous administrations had been confronted Netanyahu proposals to do similar things, and both the Biden and Obama administrations decided it wasn't in the U.S. interest to do it. It wasn't in the U.S. interest to pursue regime change or a long-term military conflict with Iran, because the benefits, as we're seeing, are probably not so great relative to the uncertainties and the risks and the economic and other costs. So this administration does it, and we're still trying to understand why. But in any democracy where there is some public consultation, some degree, even in foreign policy, where presidents have much more autonomy, some degree of public deliberation, consultation, some checks on executive power, some deference to the State Department, to diplomacy, to expertise. I think it's very unlikely that the government would pursue this foreign policy. This was a very costly, reckless war of choice, and it was done because we have a very personalistic government, a personalistic president who is accountable to no one, who is not accountable to his party, is not accountable to the Congress, is not accountable at all to his cabinet. And when that happens, you can have reckless behavior, you can have destructive behavior, and you just can have mistakes. And I think this was a mistake, a costly one.
Yeah, I mean, on the constraints on the executive, one of the things I've noticed is that several war powers resolutions have failed in Congress, which is interesting because the war powers resolution is one mechanism through which Congress can insist upon congressional consultation, right? So it's not even necessarily like that big a constraint. It's just basically saying like the president has to consult with the legislature and conduct war making in a manner in which there's respect for the fact that the country is a democracy. And those have failed in Congress, right? So it's not, it's sort of like Congress ceding its authorities to the presidency. And
That is a consequence of
Go
a highly personalistic party. For the
Yeah.
first time in the history of the Republican Party, it has no real institutional life of its own, independent of Trump. It is a personalistic party.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I think it's interesting because we actually see that kind of pattern in countries that go to war, whether they're democracies or not. Like war can actually provoke a backsliding episode by itself. If it happens during a backsliding episode, it can accelerate it. And there's a paper actually that came out in January by Ephraim Ben Melech and who else wrote that? Um, Montanaro. And it came out in the NBER. I think they're economists, but they show that although there's no particular association between democracy and the onset of international war, there's a very strong association between the onset of war and the further deterioration of democracy at home. And they argue that that's because, quote, it enables executives to expand their authority and implement institutional changes that would have been difficult to enact in peacetime, end quote. And those institutional changes include things like censorship of the media, purges of the judiciary, restrictions on civil liberties, sometimes suspensions of the Constitution or declarations of martial law, and the like. And so their argument is actually that the relationship between democracy and war is kind of the reverse, which is war weakens democracy. But there's also a very large international relations literature talking about how democratic backsliding, or really transitions away from democracy to authoritarianism, or even the reverse, are some of the least stable times when it comes to peace for countries. Institutional weakness or institutional incompatibilities at different levels of government or different branches of government can create frictions that mean that the executive is super unconstrained and actually incentivized to try to use the military to shore up institutional stability. And so, the implications of that usually have been for civil conflict. And there's plenty of research out there suggesting that like mixed regimes, or what are sometimes called anocracies, which are kind of hollowed out democracies, are more likely to have things like civil conflict set on, and just have a more difficult time maintaining democracy under those circumstances. So I think that the implications of the international behavior of the United States are also worrying for the state of democracy here. And there has been some evidence already of things like threatening media outlets who are not promoting positive coverage of the war, with FCC investigations and things like that. And I think it's just something for Americans to pay attention to when it comes to the ways that the war might begin to further interfere with democracy promotion at home. Can we talk a little bit about Cuba and your outlook there? I mean, there's not a ton of reporting going on that I've been privy to, but I have paid a little bit of attention to some of the English news sources on it, and it seems like it's a quite desperate situation at this point, of people's food spoiling in the refrigerator, people who are growing crops unable to get the crops into the cities because there's no gas for cars, trash piling up in the alleys of Havana because the government doesn't have gas to put in the trucks to collect the garbage, hospitals in blackouts because there's no electricity or backup generators available. So what happens in a situation like this? Does the country, does the civilian population demand change in its own government? Does it demand that the U.S., open the sea lanes? Who does it blame? Who does the population blame for this kind of suffering? And what are the implications of that for the sort of long term of the country?
These are tough questions, because this is, again, a pretty unprecedented situation. That the Trump administration's strategies are outside the box, to put it simply. This is just not typical 21st century international relations. It's important to note that the Cuban regime was in bad shape to begin with. The economy was in terrible, terrible shape, especially really throughout the 2020s, since COVID. The regime, there are not good public opinion data, but the regime was pretty unpopular. In recent years, there have been protests in Cuba, really for the first time in the history of the revolution. There's been protests against the communist regime. So I think there's very good reason to think many Cubans would like regime change. Um, and one can never, as you know better than anybody, one can never predict when mass mobilization will occur. I do think it is less likely in a context in which people are in an emergency situation and struggling uh, just to literally meet daily needs. And Cuba is descending into a profound humanitarian crisis, as you noted, in part because it's an island and it's being blockaded. So the United States has bullied countries, most importantly Mexico, has used trade threats to bully Mexico not to deliver uh, oil to Cuba, and Mexico has complied, and all other governments have complied. So this blockade of Cuba has left it completely alone, completely abandoned, and without energy, which is pretty devastating thing to do. It has not been done to this revolutionary government, and we don't know how it's possible to know how the public will respond, and it's difficult to know how the government will respond. Now, the government has already begun to make concessions. It's being compelled to open up economically. Um, we don't know how far the U.S. will go. I mean, I think Marco Rubio has been clear throughout his career that he would like to see a profound regime change in Cuba. I think he would like to see democratization in Cuba. Um, Trump, I think, worries a lot about boots on the ground and is enamored again with his little spectacle in Venezuela, where he could just replace one leader with another. It doesn't actually change the regime. So I couldn't tell you what the US's plan is. I think a lot will hinge on Iran, right? If the US gets bogged down in Iran, that probably makes significant action in Cuba less likely. If the U.S. if Trump is politically badly burned by Iran, that may make at least military action in Cuba less likely. But the U.S. does seem intent on strangling this regime until it says uncle. And I think in some way, shape, or form, it probably will say uncle, whether that means democratization or just sort of economic opening and turning over economic assets to the United States or maybe to the Trump family and friends. That I can't say.
So we're going to get to some audience questions shortly. I want to start with a couple that were submitted in advance, which are questions about what Americans abroad can be doing right now, which is an interesting idea. So there are two related questions. One is, what does history tell us about expats supporting democracy in their country of origin when living overseas? I know so many Americans are relocating away from the US, but still want to support democracy in the US. And then there's another one that says, what is the role, if any, of Americans abroad, particularly in Latin America, to influence a stronger democracy in the US? Curious about your thoughts about this.
Well, there are many examples in history, particularly in relatively recent history, of expats mobilizing for democracy in their home country. Venezuelans and Cubans in the United States have spent a long time doing that. Many Iranians in the United States have worked to support democracy movements in Iran. Going back further, there were a large number of Taiwanese Americans and Taiwanese Canadians that struggled to support the emerging democracy movement in Taiwan in the late 20th century, in the 1970s and 80s. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to influence a country from abroad. Very often, it's primarily fundraising and organizing. The more repressive the home regime is, the more that democracy movements rely on organizing outside of the country. For example, China and Russia today, or Cuba today, it's really only people outside the country that can seriously organize. That's not the case in the United States. We're not dependent on our expats abroad to organize. And the U.S. is also a very rich country, so the impact that funding from Americans abroad would have is more modest as well. So you know, all citizens ought to be working, citizens both within and outside the United States ought to be working. And we've discussed the dozens of different ways that we can act. But I'm not sure that Americans outside the country can have a really an outsized impact the way that they might have in other countries.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the one thing I would add, though, is that no administration lasts forever. And when the United States is on the other side of its current experience, um, there will be a need for there to be more friends abroad than foes, once again. And so there's this thing called track two diplomacy, which is basically using civilian to civilian exchanges to reinforce and cultivate good relationships between different countries. And I think Americans abroad are in a good position to continue that important and valuable work, and to make sure that 10, 15, 20 years from now, when the U.S. is still needing to have friends abroad and reestablish important alliances and things along those lines, that there's been some useful relationship building and good feeling among civilians of those countries. So that's just one thing that occurs to me. That's a superpower of people living abroad.
Good point.
Um, okay. There are some really interesting questions coming in, and one of them is to the last thing you just said, which is about what are the specific ways people can start preparing now to protect the 2026 elections. And the questioner is asking about everyday Americans, not election officials or lawyers. And we've talked about this a few times on our webinar, but maybe we can reiterate your formulation that you and Dan and Lucan published in Foreign Affairs about the ways that people can struggle for democracy.
Um,
You sort of
do,
talked about
do,
in the ballot box, in the courts, and in the
oh
streets.
yeah. So I mean, very fortunate because this is not true in all authoritarian contexts. Very fortunately, Americans continue to have three really important avenues that we can through which we can pursue um, redemocratization or the defense of democracy. And um, the the most prominent is elections, and that's going to be absolutely crucial in 2026. And there are certainly many ways to defend the ballot, but one of the keys to restoring democracy is simply going to be winning that election decisively for pro-democratic candidates and pro-democratic forces to win that election decisively. The courts are another really critical avenue. I think it's pretty clear now that the courts alone are not going to save us, but it's also clear that the courts can play an important role. And again, it's one of three important avenues, not our savior, but not insignificant. And the other is I call it the streets. I think it's much more than that. It's citizen action, broadly speaking, and that can take many forms. And I'm not gonna speak too much on that because it's your area of expertise. But um, one thing is clear. I guess it's very easy to say, but it's very clear that we absolutely need to be working in all three of those arenas. It's not any single one. I think it's clear will not be sufficient. But all three operating together and Americans working, lawyers working through the courts, candidates and politicians working in elections, citizens in civil society and others working day to day through activism. Um, I think that has already begun to achieve a lot in the last 6 months, in the last 6 to 9 months that we've been talking. and stands a good chance of, at the very least, sort of restoring the somewhat dysfunctional but real democracy that we had a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think there's a really helpful guide that was actually written for the 2020 election, called the Hold the Line Guide, and I'm gonna post it in the chat for our listeners, and our team can maybe make sure they see that. The guide basically, what's useful about it, in my opinion, to this question is that it tries to get to the question of what can people do where they live, to make sure that uh, that election results are respected. And it's a great question because, in fact, that whether election results are respected or not, is something that is close to home, because of the way that our elections are administered and thousands of different, electoral uh, precincts and districts and voting places and everything around the country. And so the Hold the Line Guide is useful because it's basically suggesting that people connect with their neighbors, their communities, and that they build a plan based on their own spheres of influence and who they know, to try to get pledges and commitments from their election administrators and other people to uphold the voters' choice. And, I think that when it comes to the when it comes to the question about what everyday citizens can do as opposed to lawyers and officials and everything, the most important thing is just to get with the people who are around, in one's community and one's neighborhood, get to know one another, make sure folks know their neighbors, and that they're organizing around common concerns. And there's like a ton that can be done, right? And even if it's not on the grand scheme of democracy protection, but you discover a common concern that's shared among neighbors, that there can be some action taken together that builds a muscle that has been kind of atrophied in the United States for a number of years. So that's what I'd recommend. Check out the Hold the Line Guide, see if it applies to your community today and gives you any ideas.
I mean, look at neighbors in Minneapolis earlier this year.
Exactly.
That was neighborhood action. That was people just, providing meals or taking people to school, taking people to the doctor. That action by neighbors really has played a role in turning the tide in this country.
Absolutely. So, um, one of the questioners asks, I think this is to you, Steve. A lot of countries have been negatively impacted by this administration, and we're going to have a lot of work to do to repair the relationships we've seen eroded. We can't just say, oops, are bad. They're going to distrust us, and rightfully so. But in Tyranny of the Minority, you correctly identified the mechanisms that make minority factional rule possible in our country. If we can point to these structural flaws in our democratic system, identify the ways in which they've been exploited, and take meaningful steps to address the structural flaws with interventions like approval voting in general elections and top four nonpartisan primaries, how long would that go toward ensuring that we can give assurances to our allies that this kind of thing won't happen again?
I mean, you're absolutely right that or the questioner is absolutely right that this time we're not going to be able to pull a whoops are bad like we tried in the Biden administration. There is a permanent loss of trust or confidence in the United States as a partner, as an ally, and certainly as a leader of the liberal West. Whatever you thought of the U.S.'s role since World War II in leading the liberal West, I think that I think we've surrendered that role possibly permanently. Close allies, allies as close as Canada are planning for a post-American future. And I'm not sure we can ever go back at this point, which is not to say we can't go back to being playing a positive or at least benign role in the world. But the role that we had in the late 20th century may be surrendered forever. I mean, there are a number of institutional reforms that the United States can carry out to make itself more democratic. We lay out a bunch of them in Tyranny of the Minority. Some of them are very hard because they require constitutional reform. Others require, at the very least, statutory changes that probably require bipartisan consensus. So we're including in very important electoral reform, some of which were just mentioned. I think those are very positive. I think they can make us more democratic. I think they would make us less vulnerable to MAGA-style takeover. I mean, just very quickly, the illiberal far right represents roughly a maximum of about 30% of electorates in rich democracies in Europe and the United States. And so the issue is how much political power does that 30% exert? In continental Europe, that 30% is often an important political party, but nowhere does it govern alone because of Europe's parliamentary democracies with mostly proportional representation electoral systems. So that 30% is either an opposition, like in Germany, or it's a junior partner in government in a few countries. In one country, in Italy, it's a senior partner in government, but nowhere does it govern alone. And it hasn't, at least to date, done as much damage to democracy. Only in the United States, among rich democracies, does that 30% govern alone. And that has to do with a number of our extremely counter-majoritarian institutions. So I think large-scale institutional reform that democratized the country would make it less likely that 30% can capture the national polity and govern. I don't think that a set of rules or institutional reforms is sufficient to restore the U.S.'s trust in the United States on the international stage. That's can only be done. I mean, the proof will be in the pudding. That will only be restored through multiple governments, Democratic and Republican, that adhere to international norms, that are good allies, that are good partners, and that don't engage in rogue-like behavior. So that's going to take time. That's going to take multiple governments of both parties before we can even begin to restore that level of trust.
Thanks for that. So we're getting a couple of questions about no kings. One of them is, what short-term impact on democracy backsliding do you feel this upcoming Saturday's No Kings protest may have? And another, which is, how important is a robust, widespread turnout at live protests at a time like this? So maybe I'll start with this one.
You start.
I think that, large-scale shows of discontent and resistance are very important during backsliding episodes. And as Steve mentioned, there's sort of three domains, the courts, the ballot box, and the streets, in which pushback to authoritarian consolidation is like equally important. Like there needs to be these multiple domains of such pushback. And I think authoritarianism can't fully consolidate when there are open and visible sides of opposition, like mass protest. It's just still, it demonstrates that the consolidation is contested and incomplete, and that sends important signals both to the pro-democracy population, and it sends signals to the aspiring authoritarians. I think the other thing that large-scale protests can do is it can provide encouraging signals of people not being alone in their opposition and registering in very large numbers, that there's a significant number of people in the population who not only don't like what's happening, but are willing to commit their own time, resources, energy, and social capital to pushing back on it. There's also plenty of research that shows that even single days of protest can have, or at least are correlated with changes in electoral outcomes, when it comes to turnout, when it comes to how many people run for office in the end and become engaged in their political scene, and how many people vote for the opposition party come midterm election time or during presidential elections. There's plenty of research on that, and it shows that this is true for protest on the right and protest on the left, such as it is. So I think that it's very important not to underestimate how valuable in a backsliding episode mass protest is. It's also important not to overestimate how important it is on its own to achieve the type of leverage over the pillars that uphold an authoritarian regime or that are helping it consolidate power. And so typically in the civil resistance space, people talk about not just protest, which is considered kind of a symbolic method of persuasion, but they also talk about methods of non-cooperation. So this would be things like consumer boycotts or limited strikes. And they talk about the development of alternative institutions or other methods of intervention that allow power building in the midst of consolidation of authoritarianism. So all of these things are important and are important in addition to the more institutional methods of pushback, like the courts and elections. But they're sometimes related to each other, right? So if there's no like protest movement, it's very hard to imagine that elections turn out well for pro-democracy candidates. It's very hard to imagine that court cases with a silent pro-democracy majority over time begin to rack up big gains for the pro-democracy movement. The movement is the foundation of the other two institutional domains in which not just defensive democracy, but pro-democracy gains can be made. So I think if protest is what people are doing to associate with the pro-democracy movement this weekend, then that's where pro-democracy people should be.
Could not agree more. That the three arenas are very much interconnected, and protest, among many things, sends really important signals to the media, to politicians, to judges. Judges pay attention to what's going on around them, and sends important signals to the government. So I think the point you made, Erica, earlier, that it is really difficult, if not impossible, to consolidate authoritarianism while there is large-scale civic contestation is right on.
We have an interesting question about the role of business. So along with decline of trust in the US as an ally has come a decline in the value of US brands, some say. I like the qualification of that. That's a good way to ask that question. What can be done to make affected businesses more vocal and insist in resisting the current authoritarianism? It seems to be in their self-interest to do so, but they travel in herds and few stand out for demonstrating courage. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, businesses are really important actors in capitalist democracies, inevitably. They have a lot of resources, and it's really impossible, actually, for a robust opposition movement, including candidates and civil society and foundations, all of civil society, without a pretty robust private sector, without support from the private sector, it's really hard to sustain that infrastructure. So business is inevitably important. And those of us who studied democracy for a long time have been repeatedly disappointed by business, sort of expecting business to stand up for democracy, because you can make a pretty good argument that a rule of law is very much in the medium and long run interest of the private sector and of capitalism. The problem is that individual capitalists don't always see it that way in the short run. And as we've seen, the Trump administration was very effective very quickly in making it clear that if you wanted to continue making a lot of money during this administration, you had to be on good terms with the government. If not, you risked losing government concessions, contracts, licenses, and you certainly risked unfavorable regulatory rulings. And so, businesses across this country, especially the biggest ones, the ones that deal with the government, decided early on that the best way to continue making money was to either align itself with the government, or shower affection on Trump, or at least sort of hide in the closet and not say anything. And that's really costly. But there are things citizens can do and have done and are beginning to do. Consumer boycotts historically don't have a really great track record, but we have a massive, massive upper middle class in this country. Blue America is pretty well off and has a hell of a lot of consumer purchasing power. And so it needs to be for firms, as the questioner said, firms have to realize that their brand is at stake and that their brand would be better off, would be in better shape if they do the right thing in terms of democracy. And consumer pressure can make a difference there. And I think this is an avenue. Again, this is an area you've thought more than I have, Erica, but I think this is an avenue where we're going to see more that the role of the combination of sheer wealth in this country and social media, I think will allow consumer boycotts to be, or consumer pressure movements at least, to be more effective in the future than they ever have been in the past. So I'm actually quite optimistic that that can be done, not for all of the private sector, but for elements of it.
Yeah, that might add a fourth domain to your formulation, that in the courts, in the streets, at the ballot box, and in the wallet.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is interesting to see, the big business kind of segment in a way over certain types of actions that they're that the administration wants them to do. So just a couple of weeks ago, we saw a standoff between Anthropic and the Pentagon, right? And now that's gone to court. Jamie Dimon was asked to contribute to the Ballroom Project in the White House and made a statement, I think to the Wall Street Journal. I'd have to check my source on that, but I think it was reported across a lot of media outlets that he basically said, we said no, we declined to contribute to the Ballroom Project because, we need to think about how such a thing would look to our investors, which we have a very broad range of clients. And we also need to imagine what a future Department of Justice would make of such a contribution. Right. So what was really interesting about that statement, in my opinion, was it was the first time that I'd seen anyway, a public acknowledgement by a major corporate figure, in this case, potentially the most successful banker of his generation, basically say this is a temporary, that this too shall pass. And when the U.S. is on the other side of this, J.P. Morgan will be in better shape for not having collaborated on certain things than others. And so the admission that that an authoritarian consolidation effort is not a permanent thing, and that the bank intends to outlast it, I thought was an intriguing admission. And if more corporate leaders were thinking that way, it might actually be, it might actually build more power and pressure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problem with the first 6 months of this administration was that very, very few powerful actors, business and other university leaders, law firms, media companies, very, very few actors could extend their time horizons that far. Trump at that time felt like forever, and very few people could extend their time horizons beyond that. And one sign that democratic forces are chipping away and maybe beginning to turn this thing around is that more and more actors are beginning to look beyond Trump and beyond this authoritarian period. That's good. We need to keep it up.
Yeah. Well, Steve, always a pleasure. And thanks to everyone who joined us for today. And make sure to join us next time, which will be May 21st at 12 p.m. We will include a link to register and a follow-up email along with the recording of today's discussion and a bunch of links to the references that we provided. So we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.